Okay, so the subject today is the Russian Poseidon nuclear autonomous vehicle, NATO codename Kanyon. We're going to go into a fair bit of detail about what is known in the public domain. Obviously, there is some additional information out there that I can't share, or things that haven't been shared with me either. But I think you'll learn a fair amount, and it's going to generate lots of food for thought, because this really is a game-changing innovation that's going to make a lot of people have to think a lot harder about how we conduct subsea warfare, and in particular, how on earth do you detect and counter systems like this? So the first picture at the top of the screen there is a montage. It was one of the earlier pictures taken of the test vehicle. As far as we know, that's it. Everything we've seen, and certainly the engineering layouts of the submarines that have been developed to carry this weapon, suggest that the image is generally realistic. We have no great reason to think that Poseidon is a shape other than a long cylinder. There have been some artist impressions doing the rounds that depict it in a sort of a bulbous, highly streamlined hull form, possibly even supercavitating, but that doesn't really match what we know about the submarines that have been developed to carry it. So as I said before, for those who've just joined, I got particular thanks to H.I. Sutton for some of his images in this presentation. And I see he's in the audience as well, if anyone wants to ask him any questions later on. Right, so what do we know about Poseidon so far? The initial timeline, it goes like this. So early hints, people thought the Russians were up to something, but we didn't really have too much evidence about it. Now, excuse me, I've got oversensitive mouse here. I'll stop touching it. First indications then back in 2008, when the Special Projects submarine Sarov was modified with a longer bow, much longer bow, about a 5-meter extension, which suggested that she was going to be used to test a particularly large class of torpedo. By 2010, satellite images were coming in from the Russian harbor, showing components such as the lifting frames and barges that would be suitable for carrying such a vehicle. Excuse me, just letting somebody else into the meeting. In 2012, Admiral Vladimir Vysotsky mentioned that the K-139 Belgorod submarine was going to be finished as a special missions platform. And we'll have a little bit more about Belgorod as we go through the talk. Between 2013 and 2015, Poseidon is seen in various blurred satellite images. November 2015, and this is the picture in the top right here, if I move the mouse around, there was a particular leak, in inverted commas, or deliberate leak on Russian television, showing this system status 6, and it depicted it as a large cylindrical vehicle with a very large nuclear warhead, with a range in excess of 10,000 kilometers, that was designed as obviously as a military system to be carried by the Belgorod submarine. And you can see a frame grab from the original TV program there on the top right. 2016, Bill Gertz reported in media in the United States that Russia had tested the vehicle in November 2016. And then in March 2018, Vladimir Putin announced 6 new Russian strategic weapons, which included a nuclear-powered cruise missile and also this system. They had a public poll to name the new undersea weapon, and the Russian citizens selected the name Poseidon. The NATO reporting name for the system is Kanyon with a K. December 2018, the paper TASS reported the testing was underway. Throughout 2019, we were seeing consistent reports in the Russian media quoting either 200 kilometers per hour or 200 knots maximum speed for Poseidon with suggestions that it was supercavitating. Now, for those of you that know anything about hull forms, this doesn't look like this is not a 200 knot torpedo. Supercavitating torpedoes do exist. These are usually rocket powered devices that eject a gas stream from a special nozzle on the nose, and the high-speed torpedo travels within a plume of gas, a plume of bubbles, removing the friction from the seawater, and they can indeed do these kind of 200 knot type speeds. Can't go around corners very well, but they are designed to go very, very fast in a straight line. Now, the hull form for Kanyon is completely wrong for that. It's not designed for supercavitation. There's no point having a nuclear-propelled autonomous underwater vehicle that needs to have a rocket pack installed to be able to supercavitate. There's no sign of a nose opening or any orifices in the hull for ejecting gas. And also the control fins are quite short. They wouldn't protrude through the gas cloud to be able to steer the vehicle at speed. So in all likelihood, the real top speed of the vehicle is likely to be of the same order as conventional torpedoes. So you're probably talking about 60 knots flat out, and it would cruise at a considerably lower speed. Also during 2019, we saw press reports coming out that suggested that the Russians have at least 32 of these systems on order. As recently as May, Vladimir Putin stated in an interview on Russian TV that Russia had developed new offensive strike weapons that the world has never seen and would force the USA to catch up. And interestingly, and we'll come back to this throughout the presentation, he blames the USA's development of advanced anti-missile systems for the deployment of systems such as Kanyon, but also of the hypersonic new warheads that have been designed for some of their missile systems. Right, let's see if my screen will still click. Yes. Okay, so here are the specifications we know about in the public domain, and here again one of my my images courtesy of H.I. Sutton. Now the released images, if they do represent the actual vehicle, and we believe they pretty much do, or at least its early form, they show a length of at least 20 meters, a diameter of about 2.5 meters. We don't know the mass, but it's going to be in the order of many tons. This is a very, very large machine, some 30 times the size of a typical heavyweight torpedo. So we're not looking at something you can just add to the launch tube of a conventional submarine. It's believed it's able to dive in excess of 1,000 meters. Now, the initial sources, including those leaked Russian TV reports, were suggesting a very large warhead, order of 60 megatons. This would be in the scale of the Tsar bomber that was tested by the old Soviet Union, back in the darkest days of the Cold War. So very large nuclear warhead, and cobalt salted in order to guarantee the maximum possible highly radioactive fallout. We have no idea if that is true. There are more recent sources suggesting that the thermonuclear warhead on Poseidon is more of the order of 2 megatons and is not carrying a cobalt salted warhead at all. But we don't know. Obviously, there are quite large uncertainties. Either way, even a mere 2 megatons is considerably larger than, for example, the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombs. And were you to detonate a system such as this in a shallow harbor environment, so you come swimming into Seattle or into San Francisco or into New York or into London, Portsmouth, Shanghai, Tokyo, any of these large coastal cities, a shallow water explosion with a high yield nuclear warhead is going to throw thousands of tons of irradiated shingle, sand, rock, water into the air in the target area. So you not only have the destructive effect of the nuclear explosion itself, but an extremely radioactive environment that, if it is cobalt salted, will remain radioactive for many centuries. So this is an extremely potent nuclear warhead, particularly if it is of the 60 megaton class, but even at 2 megatons, that's a serious piece of kit. The range is global. It's at least several months range. We've seen the Russians quoting 10,000 kilometers. There's no reason to doubt that. The real speed, yeah, the propaganda said 200 kph. Reality, probably more like a 60-knot sprint. Not least of which, because if it is traveling at 200, it's going to make a noise like an express locomotive and be very, very easy to detect and counter. Because it's so much larger than a heavy torpedo or submarine-launched ballistic missile, it would require a specialist deployment platform. You can't just put this thing into the torpedo tubes of a conventional submarine. One big question, and it's very important, particularly bearing in mind the history of the former Soviet Union and more recent Russian accidents involving radioactive materials, we have no knowledge of the vehicle's maintenance requirements or what the dose would be to nearby workers. A system that is that small with a nuclear reactor is not going to be carrying a lot of shielding. This thing is not going to be carrying tens of tons of, lead or concrete or anything else. So this vehicle is going to be hot radioactively. That means it is going to pose fairly significant hazards for the crew of the submarine that deploy and operate it. It's going to leave a radioactive trail in the seawater behind it. And if one is lost in an accident, it's going to be a fairly significant nuclear incident that will require specialist cleanup. So what is its role? And this is kind of one of the questions that's got people scratching their heads a little bit. I suppose the consensus is it's a second strike weapon. The thing is, Poseidon is quite slow. Even if it can travel at 60 or 70 knots, and even if it could travel at 200 knots, it's going to take several days to travel from Russian coastal waters out to a target location. Now, I've got a map up there in the top right, which is a polar projection. So we're looking down on the Arctic ice. And imagine you're Russia, you decide to launch some of these systems. You can head off, you can launch it from within Russian waters. You could stay right up close, within the 12-mile limit if you wished, let alone the 200. You have plenty of time. This thing has unlimited endurance. So off it goes. It can head on down, past Greenland and then, down to the east coast of the United States or into, British or French or other opponent ports. Or it can go down through the Bering Strait, which is obviously a fairly significant choke point, but it could head, down the west coast of the States as well, and target cities on the west coast. If you're deploying it from a mothership or a submarine, so you're not launching it from within Russian waters and not constrained by those choke points, then clearly you can deploy this weapon from anywhere in the global ocean. So it's slow, and that does give an opponent more time to detect and counter it, but it is still going to be a very, very difficult weapon to detect. So the working assumption is it's a second strike weapon. By that I mean a weapon in the event of nuclear war that is launched to retaliate after an opponent's first strike has attacked you. So it's part of the old Cold War mutually assured destruction concept. Idea being somebody launches a surprise attack on Russia, perhaps destroys Russia's major cities. Then Poseidon can be launched and it arrives days, even weeks after you think you've just beaten Russia, and destroys your coastal cities, docks, harbors, and infrastructure. So if the purpose of the weapon is nuclear deterrence, stopping somebody from attacking you in the first place, then clearly it makes an awful lot of sense. Sorry, I'm just letting in. I've just got a couple of late arrivals I need to let in. Okay, here comes Elizabeth and Jonathan. Right. Okay, so we're assuming a second strike weapon because it's relatively slow, designed to arrive, in the days or weeks after a first strike against Russian territory. It could, at least in principle, be deployed as a first strike weapon if you wished. Now, a couple of ways of doing this. You could either deploy it as a first strike weapon if its arrival at the target area is coordinated with a missile strike. So, you could have, Poseidon or several Poseidons heading to engage their coastal targets on the same day, date, even hour as a projected missile strike. Risky tactic, but you could do that. The other thing that you could do with the system is, have it in a kind of stealth mode, just patrolling off your opponent's coast. And if there is the ability to be able to speak to headquarters, it could be that you have this thing on long-term patrol and you order it in when required. Now, another suggestion that's been put forward by one of the open source intelligence community is it's just possible that perhaps Poseidon isn't simply a strategic weapon designed to attack cities. It could have a tactical role, perhaps following around US carrier strike groups, or to tail the opponent's nuclear weapon carrying submarines. It's again possible. It has the endurance and it would have the speed to be able to do those jobs. Tailing a carrier strike group is probably more technically possible than tailing an opponent SSBN, but it would require the system to surface on a fairly regular basis and have some kind of communication with shore in order to know where the carrier strike group is so that it can follow it. Once it's within range, it could potentially, using passive sonar, follow the strike group around, and then in event of conflict, it's able to launch itself into the middle and try and catch that big aircraft carrier target. To tail an opponent's nuclear submarines, a much harder task. We don't know in the public domain how often the Russians successfully ever managed to have a tail on an SSBN with one of their own hunter-killer submarines. My understanding is that it hasn't happened that often, if at all. So if that is the case, I think it's pretty unlikely that Poseidon would be in any position to be able to tail an opponent's SSBNs. The only possibility where it might be able to do so is if you had the deployment platform, the mothership, the submarine that's carrying Poseidon, positioned outside an opponent's submarine base. So I suppose in principle off the Clyde or off one of the big American bases. You could launch Poseidon as you see one of the Trident boats go past, hope it gets an early tail, and then follow it around on patrol. So maybe there are ways, but I suspect with present technology, that's too hard. It's most likely to be a second strike weapon, certainly in my own opinion, and possibly having a role against the carrier strike groups as well. Remember Putin's original comment. He said that the reason for the deployment of these systems was because the US anti-missile systems had unbalanced nuclear deterrence. I think that statement would suggest to me that he is minded to think of it as a second strike weapon to deter attack on Russia. Next slide. There we go. So how is it launched? With almost unlimited range, there's no need to get close to the opponent's coastline to launch the system in the first place. Yeah, you could launch it from within Russian territorial waters. The initial submarine host is the project 09852 Belgorod, which is a specialist platform used for all manner of special missions, possibly, tapping people's telephone lines, fiber optic interventions, that kind of stuff. And it does appear to have been modified during construction to be able to host some of the Poseidon systems as well. But the mainstream host at the moment, I believe only one under construction, which is Project 0951, the how do I pronounce this? Khabarovsk class of submarine, which carries, I believe, tubes for 8 of the Poseidon weapons. Remember that as far as we know, Russia has 32 of these on order. So 32 of the Poseidon systems on order. So it could well be they're planning to build additional submarines in the Project 09851 class. It could very easily be deployed from a surface ship. Any ship with a sufficiently large crane would be able to deploy the weapon, and indeed it could be shore launched. There's no good reason why you couldn't just get a HIAB, lift the thing into the sea, and off you go into the ocean wave. We have seen speculation that there's a seabed launched variant, so you would have a containerized launch module that would sit down there on the seabed. We know the Russians have done this before with missiles. So it could be that we're getting duff data, and that the so-called SCIF seafloor launched variant might actually be a bit of a red herring, and what's really happening is that's a missile launching mode. But nonetheless, it's possible that seabed-based launch pods or silos could be an option for Poseidon 2, which does again raise quite a few questions about what is its, is this a sealed unit? What are its maintenance requirements? How long, if, as some suggest, it has a very large yield thermonuclear warhead, how long does the tritium gas reserve last? How much maintenance does it need? Can you really leave this thing in place for weeks or months at a time on a seabed launch system with no human maintenance? I suspect it's too complicated a system to really be able to do that. Next slide up again. So here we go. Can it be detected? Good questions here. Anything that humans have made makes a noise. And this thing, it has a propulsor. It is going to make a noise. So can it be detected? First of all then, how deep does it run? We believe that it can dive to at least 1,000 meters. It may well be able to go considerably deeper. That does mean it goes deeper than Western anti-submarine platforms. I can't speak for Western anti-submarine torpedoes, but certainly the crewed submarines, submarines with humans on board, would not be able to dive to 1,000 meters to pursue a Poseidon stroke Kanyon system. So it dives deeper than the present Western systems designed to counter these sort of weapons. How fast does it go? I guess about 50, 60 knots. Again, that's going to outrun certainly the submarines, but not necessarily anti-submarine torpedoes. How much radiation does it leak? Now, this system, we know it's nuclear powered. It's relatively small. It is not going to have a lot of shielding around the reactor, which means it will leak radiation. So it is possible that radioactive wake homing technology, through remote sensing and in situ sensors of various kinds, you won't be able to detect it in advance. You won't be able to see it coming, but be able to tell when it's gone past. And with a sufficiently well-placed network of seabed sensors, or with sensors mounted in autonomous underwater vehicles or surface vehicles, it should be possible to triangulate the approximate position from its radiation plume. How much noise does it make? It will make noise. There is no such thing as a system that doesn't make noise. It might not make very much. So I suspect it's going to travel pretty slowly while it's in transit mode, which is going to make it extremely quiet. It's not going to have much in the way of cooling pumps or anything like this. It's just going to be the sound of its propulsor. So there will be noise, but it's not going to be very, very much. The other key one, does it ever communicate? Is this a fire and forget system? You know, once it's deployed, is that it? Is it out there, never to speak to headquarters again? Or does it occasionally pierce the surface to send any form of communication back to headquarters? If it communicates, again, there's a potential point of weakness. You know, it might be possible to detect communications. It might be possible to, in some way, intercept or spoof the system. Next question, are they all live systems? So if they build, 32 of these things, are they all carrying warheads? Or do you have maybe 2 or 3 with a live warhead and, 10 of them racing around as decoys? We don't know. It could well be that you deliberately deploy additional systems to saturate the Western defense systems. I would assume saturation attacks are likely if that is the purpose of the vehicle to be used as a second strike weapon. And I think it's fairly safe to assume it would use a high-speed terminal dash. So it probably travels very, very slowly until it gets to within, a few dozens of miles of the eventual target area. And that's when it would do the last high-speed dash into the port or harbor it's after. So can you counter it? And grateful again to Terry Sloan and EcoSub for a nice picture of a swarm of the small sort of handheld classes of quite advanced autonomous underwater vehicles, a technology which is becoming increasingly available and increasingly capable. So if it has a signature that can be detected, there will be a countermeasure of some kind. I think this is going to see us having to invest in seafloor based detection systems spaced across wide areas, using subsea based, basically it's the underwater equivalent of Wi-Fi. It can be done. We're going to have networks of these systems, rather like the old Cold War SOSUS arrays, placed across the deep ocean, listening out for these kind of systems, trying to triangulate positions, and report back to base that there's a Poseidon heading your way. If it runs very deep, you might have to, particularly in the choke points, have patrolling autonomous underwater vehicles that have some kind of kill or countermeasures capability on board them to try and sort of intercept the Poseidon before it gets anywhere near a coastline. Obviously, the mothership or mother submarine can be much more easily detected than the vehicle itself. And that is clearly where a fair amount of effort would need to go in to detecting the system that's carrying it. Because if it's very long range, it can be launched from within what I've called the bastion area, so right up close to the Russian coast or underneath Arctic ice, which does make it extremely hard to counter. I made the comment there, CIWS stands for Close In Weapons System. Those of you familiar with anti-missile defense on ships will know that large high-value targets like aircraft carriers carry a battery of fast-firing Gatling gun type weapons designed to knock down a missile at the last minute, something that's got through the other layers of defense. Do we need to come up with some kind of oceanic version of close-in weapon systems? Will major seaports and coastal harbors need to be protected with short-range, high-speed vehicles of some kind that are designed to be able to sort of intercept with maybe only a few minutes warning high-speed vehicles designed to intercept unidentified targets heading towards your port or harbor? This might need to be a technology that gets invested in the future. Next big question for me is it legal? How many laws are you breaking if you go out there deploying a system like Poseidon? So what are its rules of engagement? Is it fire and forget, or does it ever communicate with headquarters? How does it know if the war is over? You imagine this thing takes maybe 10 days to get to its target, and somehow peace talks are broken out. Is there the ability for anybody in the Russian command and control system to be able to contact the system and say, it's okay, disarm, self-destruct or whatever? We don't know. We have no idea if it can even be communicated with. So how does it know the war is over? Oh, I've made a typo there. That should say Hague Convention 1907, Part 8. This is a beautiful little piece of law written right back over a century ago that governed the use of sea mines and torpedoes. Not all of its fine detail were followed. You know, torpedoes do not disarm if they miss their target. Sea mines do not scuttle themselves if they come free from their moorings. But Hague Convention 1907 Part 8 may be the last internationally agreed piece of legislation that covered all of these classes of autonomous weapons. We really need a 2021, 22, 23 new international global convention to define the legal basis under which these things operate. So if it does go wrong or the test article is lost, there's a very significant pollution risk. So again, you come under everything from the London Dumping Convention to OSPAR regulations to all manner of other local, regional and international laws about maritime pollution. So, you know, you're probably in breach of quite a few of those with an autonomous nuclear powered system. The crew of the mothership or submarine probably at significant harm of radiation poisoning, even by launching this, though it probably isn't as bad in that respect as the nuclear powered cruise missile, which is also being deployed by the Russians at the moment. I don't think I'd like to be one of the maintenance crew on a nuclear powered cruise missile. For it to be light enough to fly, it's not going to have much shielding at all, and that thing is going to be very, very hot. Seabed based launching, if it's outside of 12 nautical miles, will contravene the 1972 Seabed Arms Control Treaty as well. So they shouldn't really be be putting these things down in the seabed in international waters. Although, just because it's illegal doesn't mean that somebody won't try and do it. I also think, and again, my thanks to H.I. Sutton for his picture here. Once one country starts deploying systems like this, you could argue it opens the floodgates. We already know that non-nuclear autonomous underwater vehicles are becoming quite widespread systems. Oops, I need to go back a page. Right. So yeah, the non-nuclear systems are becoming widespread now. At the beginning of the year, I think it was end of February, beginning of March, the Royal Navy announced procurement of the UK's first armed extra large unmanned underwater vehicle class, not nuclear powered or nuclear armed, but nonetheless, we're seeing a fairly significant move towards autonomous vehicles able to carry weapons. When and if high-level artificial intelligence ever becomes available, you can expect the capabilities and the range of missions these kind of systems carry to multiply quite rapidly. So some thoughts on a Western response. We could build our own. It's not beyond the realms of possibility to have Western nuclear armed and powered autonomous underwater vehicles. But if your target is Russia, you've only really got Vladivostok, Murmansk, St. Petersburg, and a handful of other cities you could actually target because, by the nature of Russia's vast size and geography, there's not a huge amount of targets worthy of a large nuclear warhead compared with the West, where we have these, major continents ringed with high value cities. Were we to build such a system, would it be able to pass our safety standards? I'm doubtful that a small, unshielded, autonomous underwater vehicle would ever be legal to carry and deploy on a Western ship. I suspect, though, that a Western nuclear-powered AUV could be a potent anti-submarine warfare platform. Is that a Kanyon role? As I said earlier, I suspect it doesn't have the intelligence, the sensor fit, or the the capability to be able to actively pursue submarines. But it's not to say that that capability might not become possible in the future. And of course, there are plenty of targets in other coastal countries. But, and the photo I've got on the right there has taken the Smithsonian in Washington last time I was there. They have a display of a Russian SS-20 medium-range ballistic missile. Next to it is a US Pershing II system. Now, I served my time in the reserve forces at a point where we were very concerned about the Russian deployment of the SS-20 system in Eastern Europe aimed at Western targets. It was an extremely potent, fast-flying missile with 3 independently targeted warheads. It posed a fairly significant threat. The West put out the Pershing II in response, and also the cruise missiles. So those of you who remember the protests about cruise missile deployments. And what this did do was bring the Soviet Union and the West to the negotiating table. And significant talks were held by both sides to, we wanted to get rid of the SS-20. They wanted to get rid of Pershing and cruise, and it worked. By the West having a system that was as potentially dangerous to the Soviet side as SS-20 was to us, it brought people to the negotiating table, and we were able to negotiate that whole class of missiles out of existence, at least at the time. It could well be that one of the policy pathways for the West is that you go down the route of having to develop systems like Poseidon, simply to have a bargaining chip, a counter that we can put on the table to, try and persuade the Russians not to deploy these kind of systems at all. The safest option is not to have any of these nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed autonomous underwater vehicles. So perhaps you end up building something purely as a negotiating counter. So my conclusions for this part, and then we can move on to some Q&A, is that Poseidon is real. It's not a made-up weapon. The Russians are quite happy to admit it exists. They've got it, and they're really quite proud of themselves. They've done an excellent engineering job. It is going to be very hard to detect and defeat. It has significant health and safety and environmental impact risks. There's a significant question about how you tell it the war is over. How do you disarm a system that's slow and very powerful and designed not to talk to any humans? How do you tell it the war is over, go home, or self-destruct? It may well force the West and China to adopt similar systems just to counter it. But that could be a worthwhile option if it forces Russia to negotiate the whole class of weapons out of the inventory. So we do, what I should have added in on there is it's very important that we revisit the 1907 Hague Convention Part 8 and redraft it to be fit for purpose for the 21st century to include these kind of weapons as well. So I will finish that there. I see we've got a good number of attendants. If I click, right, I've allowed participants to unmute themselves. So if anybody has any questions, please fire away. I see we've got Mahendra's commented to me, the point of needing a global maritime convention, something we need to agree. And he adds that Severomorsk and Kaliningrad are also potential host areas for Poseidon, along with the Kamchatka area. So, any questions?
Steve, thanks to you and Mr. Sutton, we came to know about this technology, which is very dangerous. And as I understand, because I'm working in cyber security and AI arena, that this particular weapon is AI driven. So it is very difficult to control until and unless it will have a specific different command and control system located somewhere else, which is reporting to the top supreme commander of the Soviet, the Russian government. So this weapon is particularly ordered and authorized not by the commander-in-chief of the Navy, but by the president. Because these are all risky weapons, including the cruise missile, nuclear-powered cruise missile, which is also having the AI based working. So now we are moving into a very different arena. What's your opinion? And particularly Mr. Satan is also listening. So we can also have his word, because I'm a great fan of him.
Yes. Thank you, Mahendra. Yeah, I think you're right. We still don't know to what level the artificial intelligence is going to be effective in a weapon like this. Clearly, if it's a strategic weapon, which I think it is, I suspect it's strategic rather than tactical, it is going to have to be signed off at the highest level within the Russian leadership. So you are talking about a system where, you know, Mr. Putin would have to give permission for it to be deployed. In fact, if the weapon does have a secondary tactical role, one of the dangers is that if one gets picked up, for example, trying to tail a carrier battle group, how do you know in the West if is that a strategic launch? Is this a weapon that is on its way to do a first strike somewhere, or is this something out on a tactical patrol, looking for your aircraft carriers? So I think it's quite a risky system to deploy as a tactical system, because your opponent doesn't know what you're up to, and that might encourage them to unleash an attack against you, because they can tell there are Poseidons out there on patrol and they're not sure if they're on the way to a target area. So no, a lot of good questions there, and I think this system is going to keep the lawyers happy for a long, long time.
Nice one, Steve.
So what else have we got there? Do we have another good question? I can see various ones coming in on the chat. Yeah.
Steve.
Yep.
Sean Kelly here. I just have kind of two questions in point. Over the years, we saw Russia really doing a definitive line between strategic and tactical. Yeah. But we've seen a recent change, and when I say recent, I mean a few years ago, basically starting, in my opinion, with the Severodvinsk, where we all expected it to be a tactical submarine, and then the Russians hinted to it being a potential strategic piece as well. And based on that alone, I believe that we're seeing a change in doctrine in Russia now, where they are starting to do crossover systems, where, like we have done in the West for years and years, where something can serve two masters, both a strategic and a tactical master. And I would suggest that it's quite likely that there is a 60 megaton or very large megaton and a very small megaton system to suit different purposes. And I would suggest that instead of having it follow a strike group, most strike groups operate in strike group operating areas. Okay. And if you had a 2 to 4 megaton charge in a strike group operating area, you wouldn't need to follow and or track. It would be more an area denial piece as a tactical weapon than it would be as a strategic. The next is, with respect to that, the 60 megaton charge, have you looked at potentially it being used as the tsunami effect? So instead of it going into a harbor and putting fallout and nuclear debris around an area, it gets fired from offshore and then creating a massive tsunami, which could potentially take out multiple cities. Yep. And your piece about communications, we have it in the West. We can communicate with objects. Actually, our company does this, communicates with objects 2,500 nautical miles away. So if we can do it, I'm sure the Russians can do it. So if they need to recall and or shut down an already fired weapon such as this, they can put an acoustic message out for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 kilometers to tell it to shut down.
Okay, that's really helpful, Sean. Thanks for that. And it's interesting about your point on that blurring of the boundaries between strategic and tactical, and particularly if because again, my understanding is these high yield warheads, you can kind of dial a yield, can't you? As well. So it could well be that you're able to select between the massive bang if you wanted to, destroy the whole harbor, or do tsunamis, through to the sort of the 2 megaton yield or smaller. If you're after something you could plausibly get away with as a tactical strike. And that thing about area denial weapon, I think that's quite key. And one of the areas in terms of the international law, when they drafted the 1907 Hague Convention, one of the provisions was, okay, if you're going to deploy a minefield under the rules of war, how do you ensure that civilian ships, etc., don't sail into the minefield? And the law said that you didn't have to tell everybody where your mines were, but you did have to say you have sown a minefield which is roughly within this grid, this box. And you can certainly imagine a situation where, in the event of war, you could set one of these things on patrol. You declare internationally, we have a network of these armed systems out there. If you enter that box, you are at risk of being attacked. So as you say, it's a bit like the S-400, using it as a area denial weapon for aircraft. It could well be that you can deploy Poseidon as an area denial weapon. And provided there's a means of telling it come home or disarm at the end of the conflict, if hopefully things end peacefully, then that might be an very effective tactic. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, you are perfectly right that it is basically a threat weapon, area denial weapon. It will be strategic, located in and around 50 nautical miles of the US bases, or wherever the strategic submarine movement are located and the strike groups are located, or in the friendly countries which are close to Russia.
Yeah. No, it's a very, very, very good point. Yeah, thanks, guys. What else have we? Who else have we? Have we got any more hands up? I'm trying to master these wonderful Zoom systems. Oh, I got one from Samanya Huda.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to address your remark about, the West possibly developing these systems and then using it to negotiate them away. Do you think it's likely, like considering all say the time and effort gone to developing this as a solid second strike weapon? Do you think, and it's the need arises because of the US's advances in things like missile defense? Do you think there's a potential for such a system being developed to bargain stuff like that away? That the Russians are trying to get the US to, dial down some of their other strategic systems? Like, do you think that could work theoretically or practically, actually?
It's an interesting area to speculate on, because both Poseidon, but also the nuclear cruise missile, which has been deployed or at least been tested, and we think has probably gone wrong a couple of times as well. So you have the nuclear cruise missile, and you have these stealthy hypersonic new class of warheads designed to evade interceptors. It could well be that a large driver for this. I mean, Russia isn't a very rich country anymore. Its GDP is about the same size as Italy or Texas, and it must be costing Russia a huge amount of money it doesn't have to be developing and deploying these systems. So it could well be that part of the reasoning behind the deployment, as well as the deterrence effect, they obviously don't want people to attack them, but it could well be that part of the planning is to come up with a class of vehicles that force the negotiation tables to open again. So we basically don't know. I mean, the signaling is not very consistent. We're not getting Russian diplomats, so far as we know, coming to us saying, by the way, after we're developing this weapon in order to encourage you guys to get rid of your ABM system or whatever it is. But it's certainly something which may well be in their diplomats' bag of tricks, to be able to negotiate on in future. So we shall have to wait and see with bated breath, what it leads to. And perhaps they're waiting for the next election as well to see who see who ends up in the White House after January. You know, whether they've thinking about who they want to negotiate with as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any more? Oh, David Strachan.
Hey, Steve. Thanks so much for hosting this. It's like super interesting to be able to hear different perspectives on this instead of just, you know, reading what's out there in the open source community. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about detection and countermeasures. You know, as a nuclear powered device, and in the size that it is, it doesn't seem like, you were talking about, there probably isn't a whole lot of radioactive shielding. I'm wondering if there's going to be a whole lot of noise dampening that's even capable in something of that size. And then I'm curious also in terms of where the new estimates of 60 to 70 knots come from as well, because I feel like if you get down into that realm of velocity, then you're kind of within range of some of the more advanced torpedo systems like the Mark 48 or even the Mark 54. So anyway.
Okay, thanks, David. I think on the, now I don't know enough about propulsion systems to know for sure whether on something so small it would be possible to put its propulsion on anything like a vibration absorbing mat, you know, the mattresses you'd have in a regular submarine. I think it's probably safe to assume that it probably only has the minimal amount of sound dampening equipment, simply because of its relatively small size and mass. My hunch would be that it's designed to operate fairly slow and quiet until it gets to within the target area, and it probably only really cranks up the speed.
Right. When it's terminal.
Yeah, in the terminal phase, so it can try and stay as stealthy as possible to the last minute. I think it will definitely it has to, with its size and relative lack of shielding, it must leave a radioactive plume. Which does. Now the problem with radioactive plumes is in seawater, alphas and betas don't go anywhere. Your sensor's going to have to be right up next to a particle to even detect anything.
Right.
So you're only really going to pick up anything that comes out as gamma. And I'd have thought, unless the reactor design is very, very crude, I wouldn't have thought it's going to be leaving a lot of gamma behind in the seawater, but it's possible that it is. We don't know the detail of it. So I can imagine some kind of detection system based on the plume would be worth investing in. The speed-wise, it's only really the hull form, I think, is what's driving people to speculate this kind of 50, 60 knots speed. It doesn't have that kind of almost teardrop shape or reverse teardrop shape you tend to see with the supercavitating weapons. The ones that go very, very fast. It's shaped much more like a traditional torpedo, which would suggest a speed range that similar to a conventional torpedo. And the nature of the control fins at the back, again look like almost like torpedo class control fins rather than a ducted propulsor or using anything on the nose to help it go around corners. Or anything like this. So I suspect it isn't as fast as the propaganda suggests. We do keep seeing these things coming out of Russia saying it can do 200 knots. But unless there's a version that nobody's shown us, and of course another thing we don't know is this could be a family of vehicles. Now it's a bit like the comment that was raised earlier about, can you dial the yield between it being a tactical and a strategic weapon? It could well be that Kanyon turns out to be part of a family. And if so, there may well be systems. Perhaps there will be a high speed variant or a long range slow variant. We just don't know at the moment. somebody's just raised a very useful point in the chat. They're saying radiation detecting a device has been more likely to tell you where it was rather than where it is. You know, and that's a very fair point. You know, I suspect we're going to have a lot of systems that will tell us Kanyon passed by, Poseidon, you know, the Kanyon stroke Poseidon passed by, and the challenge we're going to need is what do you build that detects it before it gets to you, and that I think is where it's going to get very, very tricky indeed. And you know, the amount of almost sort of active high frequency sonar that you'd have to put into the system in order to detect it in an active manner, particularly bearing in mind, you know, you don't want to be causing hazards to, you know, marine wildlife and, you know, underwater noise legislation and such like. Pretty tricky. Doubtless in wartime, people wouldn't be worrying so much about, you know, the legality of, you know, harming marine life, but I think you would almost need to have a wall of active sonar at quite a high frequency on the approach to, you know, potential target areas in order to actively detect the system. So I hope that helps a bit. It's a long-winded answer, sorry. Yeah. Okay, do we have any more hands up? I'm just casting my eye across the screen. No, I think that is probably about it. So what I'm going to do, I will I've recorded the presentation. I'll upload it onto the SUT YouTube channel and share the address of where you can find that if anybody wants to watch it again later. And where I have any links, I'll add that into the notes. Anyone that's found this interesting, or particularly if you have amazing ideas about how to detect and counter such a system, please do get in touch with me, and I can put you in contact with those who need to know. I see Mahendra's got another question for me.
Yeah. My point is very clear. The best idea is to capture and track their carrier, because carrier has to play a very big role in strategically deploying these weapons at various strategic locations. So there they will keep quiet for months, days and years until and unless the final command comes. So the carrier submarine, yes, means. What's your opinion?
Yeah, obviously, yeah, if you can pick up the mothership, you know, whether it be a surface vessel or a submarine, that's always going to be the easiest way to catch a Poseidon. Find the platform. And it's one of the reasons I'm a bit skeptical about those who say that it would be placed in seabed launching, you know, pre-prepared seabed launching sites. There's too much chance of those being found. You know, to imagine you had a containerized system for launching the weapon. You would, unless you could deploy it from a submarine, of course, and then hopefully nobody noticed you doing it. But if you tried to deploy it from a surface ship, somebody would see you, you know, putting the system in. They'd be curious what's on the seabed where that ship just spent a long time. So there is a big issue there. And again, as someone's just commented on the Sean's just commented on the discussion, you know, if they were found, that itself would be an act, you know, potentially an act of war. You know, if somebody finds these things on the seabed, particularly if it's anywhere near your territorial waters, that's not going to end well. I mean, I suppose one of the questions with these systems too is they do offer, if you wanted to use one as a kind of a political statement or as a kind of very limited first strike, I suppose you do have an element of plausible deniability. You know, it's possible to go in and destroy somebody's coastal infrastructure or harbor and say, it wasn't me, not my, I haven't fired any missiles, not my Poseidon. It does give an aggressor the opportunity to perhaps cause destruction and just shrug their shoulders and lie and say it was nothing to do with them, which you can imagine some of the potential rogue states out there who would absolutely love to do something like that. you go into bye-bye New York, and oh, nothing to do with us. That was North Korea, or it was Iran, or or something like this. So there is. I think one of the problems with these systems is it does kind of lower the threshold of conflict, in a lot of ways, and it's like an issue which is a few people have raised about the deployment of autonomous underwater vehicles. Full stop. As you start arming them, it's possible for opponent robots to start doing all the war fighting, and then when it comes to the court at the end of the conflict, it wasn't our robot that did that, nothing to do with us, and it starts becoming quite hard to attribute blame, if that's the right word, to the various actors involved. And I can imagine there are some potential states out there who'd find that a very appealing way to fight a conflict. Yes, John, I can see you with your hand up there.
Yes, Steve, just a quickie. Great talk. Enjoyed it very much. But the depth that these things are going to operate and their size, does that eliminate them from sort of magnetic anomaly detectors?
Good point. As ever, it depends on what they're made of.
yeah, truly.
But they, I mean, they'll certainly obviously they'll be degaussed, and they'll have built them in non-ferrous materials. But they're sufficiently big, a 20-25 meter system that's got enough mass to be carrying a small nuclear reactor is going to leave some kind of signature, behind. I mean, you're going to have some level of shielding there. There's going to be some heavy metals, in the design.
Yeah.
So I suppose short of catching one, so that we could.
With a fishing rod.
Yeah, big, nice big fishing net or something. In the area where they've been tested, it would be, it'd be quite appealing to accidentally come across one.
Yeah,
take it apart and figure out exactly how it's engineered. Doubtless there'll be people working on that.
Thanks very much.
But I feel that Russians' favorite metal is titanium, which they are going to do.
They do. They like using titanium in their constructions. I suspect it will be largely titanium built. Yeah. Right. We're down to the last few survivors. Anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask? Otherwise, I'll leave you in peace to enjoy the rest of your days. Okay.
Hi, Steve.
Yeah.
H.I. Sutton here. Actually.
Hello.
I just thought I'd leave you with one final question. I think it was a really interesting point about the long-range agent using acoustic communication, and it led me to wondering whether that in itself is a potential weakness that could be exploited in the manner of a soft kill. Because if the Russians are using such communication, do you think they'd have to test it to be 100% confident it would work in the real setting? And if so, does that give a window to another line of countering?
I think you're right there. It's if there is comms, if it's not fire and forget, because I can imagine the temptation would be to build a system that does not communicate in order to remove all of those risks of interception, spoofing, cyber attack, all of the various things that could potentially be done to it. But if it can be spoken to in any way or form, that is going to be a line of weakness. And I suppose this is where good old-fashioned traditional espionage comes in to find out if anybody knows, like what frequencies does it use, what kind of commands does it accept. And of course, when it is being tested, if it does have communications, you're right, there will be a communications pathway. It could be that you design it to fly over, you can have pre-positioned locations, a sort of, short range blue laser communication, all of these kind of things, highly directional communications. You could have those pre-positioned on the seafloor or on a floating buoy on the surface. You could even deploy something out of a sonar buoy. So you could have very short range, line of sight, blue laser comms with the system, that's designed not to propagate through the water column or leave an acoustic signature around. And that thinking of the way the Russians traditionally used to operate their long distance targeting, where they, you'd have a bear flying, thousands of miles away from headquarters, relaying the mid-course, correction, instructions to long range missiles. It would be within their doctrine, of how they like to operate, to have some kind of mid-course communication set up. I suspect they would try and avoid using. They can't use ultra low frequency radio because the system is too small to be able to tow the kind of antenna you'd need. It's not going to be towing a kilometers long cable, or I suppose in principle it could, a very fine wire. So if it's not using ultra low frequency, I suspect it's either very short range sonar communication, from a pre-positioned sensor, or possibly blue laser, and doing it that way. But certainly it'd be worth people eavesdropping in on the testing in extreme detail to see what kind of signatures they pick up. Is there a hint this thing ever transmits, or is it only ever passive? That would be quite interesting to know.
I think Mr. Sutton will be the first person to know from his Russian sources how it will be detected, because he is master of getting information out of that wall.
Okay, well, it's good to have him there, and
Thank you.
And as I said earlier, thanks for letting us use your pictures. So right, I better stop it there. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks with another SUT lunchtime seminar. I suspect it won't be quite as interesting in some respects as something like this, but I hope you enjoy it. And follow us on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. Find out what we're doing, and also any volunteers for my weekly podcast, always gratefully accepted. That's it's on sut.buzzsprout.com. We're up to about episode 17 or 18 now, and they're coming out thick and fast. So thanks everybody. Good to meet you all, and nice to see some new faces as well. And I'll look forward to catching up with you all on a future episode. So thanks very much.